here. But we have both the ovary and a frontal section view of the oviducts and uterus and so on, part of the vaginal canal here. All right, so it's larger on that chart in the back. We have this sagittal view, okay, and then we have a couple of upright models that I'll refer to as well. In addition, we have this, both male and female are on here. The only view we have of a vestibule or the region between the labia is this lower area here, okay? But I'm going to move to the part in the back because it's larger and hard enough for everybody to visualize. And move that one over too. We have a couple of these. All right. So 216, 217. The term broad ligament is a term for all of the mesenteries of the female reproductive. So in lecture I talked about the mesosalpinx, the mesoovarium, and the mesometrium. Any of those are components of the broad ligament, but typically this area right here is tagged. So remember I talked about hanging a sheet over the oviduct, and that double layer of peritoneum is that mesentery. So that's letter A in your diagram on page 216. And then we have the ovary itself, which is letter R. We have two supportive ligaments for the ovary. So we have the ovarian ligament, which is connecting ovary to uterus, and that's going to be letter B. And in suspending the ovary along with the blood vessels, we have the suspensory ligament, all right, and that's letter C. We always see it with the ovarian artery and vein. Then within the ovary, we have the ovarian follicles. Remember in lecture, I went through primary, secondary, antral, mature antral. So in lecture, I'll have an image of one of those for you to identify. In lab, though, you just need to identify it as ovarian follicle. You don't have to identify which one it is. So on this by the way, I guarantee one student or two in either Lancaster's or my lab is going to identify this as a mammary gland. This is not a nipple. This is an oocyte that's being ovulated, okay? So just to set that straight when you're looking at it. So here would be developing follicles, primary, secondary. So that's all you have to identify them as. It's just developing follicles, kind of like the developing spermatocytes. Here we have one that's being ovulated. So remember I said that it undergoes meiotic division, and it changes from a primary to a secondary oocyte. So there's a possible extra half point. The correct identification, if I say name this cell, would just be oocyte. But if you recognize that that's a secondary and these are all primary, there might be an extra half point there. Okay? Once the egg is ovulated and all these other cells around here are the cumulus oophoris and corona radiata, then we have this structure right here, which is the corpus hemorrhagicum. Right. Then it starts to secrete additional hormones. Those are lipid-based, and so this becomes a large yellow structure, which is corpus luteum. And then if the egg is not fertilized, this regresses and forms the scar tissue of the corpus albicans. So yellow body versus white body. Now normally you wouldn't have two of these unless you had two eggs ovulated from the same ovary. Okay, you just have one. So in your manual, the ovarian follicles in the lower diagram are referred to as D. The corpus hemorrhagicum is E. The corpus luteum would be F. The corpus albicans would be G. And the oocyte would be H, and that would be a secondary oocyte. All right, now when we look at the oviduct, it's what's labeled there as uterine tube or fallopian tube, but I call it oviduct. And again, you can see this on several different models, but it's clearer up here. Remember, there's no direct connection between the ovary and the fimbrium. So when the egg is ovulated, the fimbrium typically move close to the ovary, but the egg might escape and be anywhere out in the peritoneal cavity. So the finger-like structures can move, And so they kind of sweep up the egg with all of the cells around it. It's kind of a sticky component. These are the fibri. Then we move into a narrowed area. It looks very similar to the pelvis. When we were describing the kidney, that's the infundibulum. And then the longer portion here is the ampulla. And then it narrows and passes through the uterine wall, and that's the isthmus. So I would be the fimbria. J is the ampulla. I'm sorry, the infundibulum. K is the ampulla. And L would be the isthmus. Now, for the uterus, the round ligament is not diagrammed on page 216, but is shown on page 218, but not lettered. So if you find the letter A, that's really referring to the space between the bladder and the uterus. But just above the letter A, you can see a cord-like structure disappearing into the abdominal wall, and that's the round ligament. The round ligament can be seen on a sagittal view best. So on this model, here again would be the secondary oocyte that's ovulated up here with all the cells around it. So here's anterior, here's posterior. And remember I said at the fundus of the uterus we have three structures. So we have the round ligament passing forward and disappearing into the deep inguinal ring, just like the vas deferens does in the male. And then the middle structure is going to be the oviduct, and then the posterior will be the ovarian ligament. All right, so in that diagram we can only see two, the one that's up on the wall. So the round ligament is not visible, but you can see it right here. Okay, so it's near the arrow for the letter A, but it itself is not actually marked, and the word is on the previous page. All right, then the layers of the uterine wall, back on page 217, of the components. So the top, remember if you take a pear and turn it upside down, the rounded bottom of the pear looks like the top part of the uterus. So this is the fundus, and that's letter M. On a sagittal view, notice this is an anteflexion, it's bent forward over the bladder. So this whole area right here would be the fundus. Okay, then we would have the body, and that would be this region here, letter V. The uterine cavity would be in, space within here. The internal os is the opening from the uterine cavity into the cervical canal. So I don't know if that's an O or a Q. It looks like there's two O's. But this opening here, whether it's an O or a Q, is going to be the internal os. We have the cervical canal, which is P. And then this would be the external os, down here, between the cervical canal and the vaginal canal. Between the two openings is the cervix, all the entire structure. That's this whole area. So it contains the cervical canal, but it's this whole area that is the cervix. The surface of peritoneum covering, so if I tag this right here, and I said identify this region, it would be fundus. If I said identify this layer of the, just the layer would be perimetrium. Myometrium is the muscle, just like myocardium was the muscle. And so myometrium could be M or V or S, anything that's on that muscle layer. And then the lining of the uterus, the epithelium plus the connective tissue, the endometrium is T. Okay. Anybody ever heard of endometriosis? It can be a cause of infertility in women. So because the oviduct is open to the peritoneal cavity, when a woman has her menstrual cycle, normally the endometrium is left off and passes through the vaginal canal, but it can go out the oviduct. Stay in the oviduct and settle and start to grow there, or pass out the opening of the oviduct and land on the peritoneum, go down, opening down into the upper part of the thigh and settle onto a blood vessel. So every time a woman goes through her cycle, those hormones are in the blood. and it will cause those areas of tissue to get thicker and more vascular and then shrink. And that can be very painful sometimes. Or it can cause blockage and scarring of the oviduct and interfere with fertilization. So that's what endometriosis is referring to. Okay, let's turn the page to 2:18 to 19. So the vagina is referring to the vaginal canal, and that would be back on the previous page, letter Y. You can just cross-reference that letter Y on page 216, along with the rugae. That's letter Y as well. So these folds, so we've had rugae now in 3 different organs: stomach, bladder, and vagina. All right. The fornix is a space created by the cervix bulging down into the vagina. So it's really a region of the vagina. It's like a moat turned upside down. So if a woman is using a diaphragm for birth control, the thickened rim of that diaphragm fits into that moat, all right, and is fitted to each woman individually. So after she has a baby, that needs to be refitted because the dimensions will change. From a frontal section of the uterus, we can see 2 of these spaces, and these are the lateral fornices. Fornis is plural for fornix, fornices. And then from an anterior-posterior view, from a sagittal section, you can see the anterior fornix and the posterior fornix. So it's kind of named as if it was a box space rather than round. It was a square space. So in the diagram, letter X on page 216 is indicating a lateral fornix, because this is a frontal view. And then, although not lettered, on page 218 you can see anterior and posterior fornices. Okay, the vestibule, as I said, is best seen on the middle lower, the large middle diagram on the chart back there where you're seeing a frontal view. The vestibule is really just the space between 2 labia minora. All right, so it's that middle diagram on the bottom half of that far left chart. And it's letter E in your diagram, so that bar is standing between the 2 labia minora. So the labia minora is the smaller, inner, thinner lip right here. And that would be letter I. And then the outer, more lateral, thicker, fleshier, has hair follicles, is the labia majora. And that's letter G. Now the clitoris is marked as letter F. It's showing the very tip of the clitoris, which is actually the glans clitoris. All right, so if you would add the word glans to clitoris, because it's like calling the tip of the penis just the penis when we know that it's the expansion of the corpus spongiosum and the most sensitive area of the penis. So the tip of the clitoris, like the tip of the penis, is called the glans clitoris. Okay, that would be letter F. The hymen is supposed to be letter C on the far right. On some of our upright models, it's just a weird thickening in the model. It's hard to see. So I seldom tag it in lab. It's just not very clear. All right. And it has various shapes. It's usually an irregular membrane that's left over from a partial closure of the vagina. Sometimes unusual, it has a complete closure, but usually it's perfect and has some openings in it. Horseback riding, a lot of the activities that modern women do, use of tampons and so on for instead of pads, all can contribute, digital intercourse, all can contribute to opening that space up and less painful intercourse the first time there's actual penile intercourse. All right, so on the page 218 then, vesicle uterine, vesicle refers to bladder. So that's letter A on the upper right hand diagram. So it would be this space right here between the bladder and the uterus. Right? And the rectouterine space would be letter B. D is supposed to be the uterosacral ligament. It's a little too low, all right? It's not coming off of the cervix. It's coming up higher than that. And the best model, the only model, question?
Yeah, I'm sorry, which letter did you say was supposed to be uterosacral?
D, but it's actually higher than that. Where's the model? It's a flat, small model. It's not an upright, it's a sagittal view. It always hides. Yes. Okay, so on this model you can see the round ligament right here disappearing into the deep inguinal ring. And then if we look right here, so here's the uterus, and that fold of peritoneum right there, you can see just about an inch of it, is the uterosacral ligament. Okay? So it goes from the posterior aspect of the uterus, wraps laterally around the rectum, and attaches to the sacrum. So this is really the best view. Our other sagittal models don't show it very clearly. Okay. Now for the mammary glands, we have, I didn't talk about it in lecture, so what I say about it now is the extent that you need to know of it for lecture. We have these models. I also have this diagram. All of these models and diagrams and concepts of the mammary gland were developed about 80 to 90 years ago by one person, and everything's based on that one person's research, in which he took female cadavers and injected a liquid wax into the gut tissue and dissected it out, laid everything out symmetrically, photographed it, drew it, and that's the basis of everybody's discussion of the mammary tissue. In fact, these lobules that secrete the milk are very close to the surface of the breast rather than way down, deep down here. There is no dilated lactiferous sinus that occurred as an artifact of the liquid wax stretching out the ducts. And so about 2005, they officially did away with his information and then based it on MRIs and actual studies of living tissue. And so here's what you need to know other than what's on your actual, so this lactiferous sinus actually doesn't exist, all right? So in a non-lactating breast, when it's not making milk and it's not, the woman who's not pregnant goes through cycles with her breast tissue. And a woman who's not pregnant, we have, and not kind of just going through the hormonal changes, we have just ducts. With estrogen, every month, these ducts multiply and form secretory cells that are capable of, under the right hormonal influence, but do not actually make milk proteins and milk sugars, and become alveoli. If the egg is not fertilized, they go back to just being ducts again. So this change happens every month, which is why some women's breasts become tender, okay, as part of that cycle of change. So what you need to be able to identify then, this would be the alveoli develop under the influence of the hormones, and you don't have to know the hormones since this is done in physiology class. So these would be the alveoli. The ducts, you don't have to worry about secondary tubules. Any ducts that you see that are not in the mammary tissue, I mean that are not in the nipple, will be mammary ducts. And when they actually get into the nipple, those will be the lactiferous ducts. Okay? Then we have this pigmented area that surrounds the nipple, and that's the areola. so this darkened region that you see around the nipple, guys have it too. It usually gets larger and darker with pregnancy, and it may get a little bit smaller after pregnancy, but usually stays larger. Alright, so the darker area is the areola. This diagram has the dilated areas, but you just need to know the ducts within the nipple are the lactiferous ducts, and outside the nipple are the mammary ducts. And then these clusters of cells would be the alveoli. They're not hollow like the air alveoli. Okay, they're just clusters of secretory cells that look a little bit like sebaceous glands.